Welcome, everyone, to the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. I am your co-host, Eric Lindblade, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Jim Hessler. Jim, tell the folks what we're doing tonight and where we're at.
Hey, Eric, welcome back. Welcome back, everybody, to the show. So after a couple of heavy episodes on Longstreet and Meade, today we're going to go a little more lighthearted as we tackle what we're calling bad history. This is going to be popular myths, misconceptions that distort the general public's understanding of the Battle of Gettysburg. Some of them might be grounded in fact, some are just plain ridiculous, and some might make us stop to think, but in most cases, they're just bad. Very, very bad. Will this become the Blame Everything on Shelby Foote episode? Listen and find out. So join us from our Happy Place recording studio at Gettysgear for a little bad Gettysburg history.
So before we get into our eagerly anticipated bad history episode, Jim, we have a special guest with us this evening, don't we?
Well, we do, as always, or as sometimes. So I guess not as always, but we're joined in the studio by Superfan Jody from Savage, who is developing quite the podcast following of her own. Welcome back, Jody. Been a little while.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back. I'm glad people are still listening after our weather episode.
The wet bulb.
The wet bulb episode.
You know, I'm hearing more and more people talking about, now you know what the heat index was on July 3rd.
Yeah.
Haven't heard that before.
And
Wonder where
that's
that came
real
from.
history. It's not bad history because it's scientific.
It's science.
Right.
Yeah. But, you know, we've always been trendsetters in terms of topics like that. So I'm not surprised to see now everybody talking about the weather at Gettysburg, which
It
is
always
great.
starts here with the Battle of Gettysburg podcast.
Yeah, which is what we're here for.
So, you know, when we think about bad history, where do we even begin? Because there's so much, and even we have to kind of, I think, qualify some things here.
Yeah.
Because when we ask the superfans on social media about, you know, what are kind of their favorite examples of bad history, we had a lot of feedback.
I was first of all going to compliment the superfans, you know, because we put the question out on Facebook. We said, what are your examples of bad history? And we had hundreds of responses.
255 to be exact.
No, I think we had more than that. I think that was just like the preliminary number. We
I
had
think that was
hundreds.
the one that was called relevant
Hundreds.
comments.
Yeah, hundreds
Okay.
of comments. And here's the thing, right?
Let's
We didn't have to prompt them with any gimmicks. They came up with some great stuff. Obviously, there were some themes that were repeated again and again. And I think that's what we're going to focus on tonight. But I think definitely most of the topics, at least that I put on my list, were chosen by the listeners because they're that good.
Oh, yeah. And believe me, a lot of them were really good, but we do need to call out some of the issues here and there because sometimes people can practice bad history and not know they're practicing bad history.
Well, we are the heel historians, so I would expect
we
that
are.
from us.
Yeah, that is what we do.
Except for Jody, you're not a heel, are you?
No.
Not yet.
Never.
So right off the bat, is this where we get accused of doing bad history because somebody isn't getting our karate or kung fu references that we're making right
you mean
now?
pro wrestling.
Yes, but you know, a lot of
Yeah.
times I get stuck. Like when people come up to me on tours, they're like, "Oh my god, I love the show, but I don't get the boxing and the kung fu references." So
Yeah,
I just thought I'd use this episode.
What show are they listening to?
I thought I'd just use this episode though to call that out.
Because actually, if there is a podcast that's talking about kung fu and boxing,
Yeah, no, it's us.
I mean, that could be kind of
It's
interesting.
yeah, our listeners are well versed in history. Some of them are very well versed in pro wrestling, but others need to be coached a little bit.
Talking about heels a lot.
Well,
What do heels have to do with?
our
don't
famous
know.
heel draft episode.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, and heels are bad. And we're doing heel history, bad history tonight. So should we, you mentioned something about sources. Should we kind of talk, first of all, a little bit about sources and where some of our maybe favorite bad history might come from?
Yeah, and I think when we look at any real bad history, or even what we call myths of the battle, in a lot of them, there is a kernel of truth somewhere in there. And it's kind of like a fish story. Somebody caught a fish, but over time, the fish just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger every time it gets told. And that's what we will see with a lot of these. And I think it's also a prime example of why you should check the sources of these things.
Mm-hmm.
We hit on that a lot of episodes of where is this coming from? And the historiography of the battle is really just as critical to understanding this battle as it is what actually happens here tactically. And so what we're going to kind of do for some of these, we're not going to do a deep dive on every one of these.
Because that would have just taken a lot of research that we just didn't do before this episode.
These are a lot of
so we're not unpacking a lot tonight.
No, we're winging it.
We're
winging
not
this one,
unpacking
Jody.
very much tonight. But I think what we'll do is kind of, a lot of these are things that we often hear on tours as guides ourselves. And I think, a good example of that, even the horse hooves.
Yeah.
I think somebody mentioned that in that. So, this is kind of what we're looking at, kind of things that are said that are maybe not fully true or maybe overblown or underappreciated.
Yeah.
There's any number of ways we can look at this, but don't immediately assume just because it's a myth that's totally at every part of it is factually inaccurate.
Let's use a couple examples here because I want to get our first Dan Sickles report out of the way right away. One of our listeners, a regular listener, I believe, said, well, I think it's bad history, all these people going around the battlefield saying that Dan Sickles won the Battle of Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. But really, does that qualify? Because do you really hear a lot of people going around the battlefield do that? No,
I would like to hear that. I think that would be kind of hilarious.
But I mean, do you really, right? There's things that are bad because they're so ingrained in the Gettysburg subconsciousness. And again, some people call them out, but do people in large numbers really go around the battlefield, saying Sickles won the battle? Or, a lot of people said tackle the ghost tours. Really? I mean, do we really need to go after the ghost tours? Because by definition, they're just kind of ridiculous. Do you really need to call out that? I think we can do better. I think we should really go stuff that people confuse with popular history. Right? And look, and I know we'll get some hate if we criticize Shelby Foote, but Shelby, for example, or the movie. I love the movie. You love the movie. Jody, do you love the movie? I don't know if we've ever talked about this. Okay, silence.
I think I'm going to become a heel right now. No, I don't like the movie.
How come?
It's very dated.
Okay. Like 1863 dated or like 1991 dated?
Like 1991 dated.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of reinforces some of the bad history.
Exactly, which is kind of where I'm going.
And I was about to say, or is it dated as in it's very much a 1960s, 70s interpretation of Gettysburg
Made
that comes to life in the 90s?
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people will go, it's based on a book and it's a novel and blah, blah, blah. But people who don't have historic knowledge will watch it and then they take it as fact.
Yeah.
That Chamberlain saved Gettysburg.
Well,
and we're coming back to that. That's my one point and gripe with some of our super
wait till
fans.
We get to July 2nd.
I was trying to help. No.
But that's exactly right. And kind of where I was going with that is, I don't want to look like I'm bashing the movie because I do love the movie. I mean, it's one of the things that got me interested in this topic. But I agree I think you made the points. It's definitely a 1960s version of Gettysburg that came to life in the 90s. But some people, as much as I love that movie, some people just keep going back to the well on that thing over and over and over. And so, I think some of the bad history definitely comes from that, based on Shelby Foote, based on some other people that, we'll talk about.
And the more I have worked as a guide here, I've done a good number of tours in my career so far. And
Me
I think
too.
You get a sense of kind of what they're coming in with in terms of knowledge. And what I am finding, there's a lot of people that will bemoan, oh, nobody knows their history anymore. Nobody teaches history. I'm going to argue that history is being taught. People are getting history, but what they're getting are very simplistic or in some cases bad interpretations of events. I mean, think about how many times to teach the Civil War do they just roll in the movie Gettysburg?
Yeah.
They show it to augment what they're studying, but these kids are still watching that.
Well, this isn't even a kid thing because a lot of programs that come here to Gettysburg to take adult programs are told to prime up with watching the movie. I have even heard of on leadership tours that the great factual example, a bastion of leadership here on this battlefield. I don't know if he was a corporal or a sergeant or a private, because I really don't care. Buster Kilrain of the 20th Maine, using him as an example of leadership. Just to get it straight,
on the battlefield.
He was Sergeant Kilrain.
Well, whatever. Didn't he get
know
demoted?
That it matters because he wasn't real.
Well, yeah, but he's Sergeant Kilrain. We should at least do honor to his fictitious memory.
But
so great point. Let me just So my background, though, is different, though, because I'm like going into the 20 years of guiding, and I think I've seen more of a generational shift.
Yeah.
Like people on social media assume we're always asked to look for Buster Kilrain's grave. Oh, I bet you get asked that all the time on tours. 20 years, I've never been asked that. And in fact, at times when I've said, hey, here's the 20th Maine monument, Buster Kilrain's not on it, 99 times out of 100, the people will give me a blank look and go, who's that? I have no idea what you're talking about. So I think movie-wise, there's a generational shift. But, God, I mean, you look at social media and that thing is still so popular. I think there's still some bad history that we need to just weed through.
Is maybe the movie Gettysburg more popular now than it ever was during its theatrical release and subsequent showings?
Yeah, it's a cult.
It's kind of it's the closest thing to a Civil War cult classic.
Oh, yeah. Well,
and I think the problem is that if you accept it at its entertainment value, and I will also give it credit for bringing thousands and probably millions of people to this battlefield through the years, but I think there's a time where the movie has almost subconsciously embedded itself in people's minds where they think that's actually what happened.
Oh, yeah. I think there's a lot of that. I mean, you mentioned a cult. When we saw the anniversary showing, 25th anniversary, whatever it was, people were shouting out the lines before things came on screen, and it definitely had that Rocky Horror Picture appeal. But cult appeal aside, there's some pieces of history in that we should just try to weed through. And we're not going to bag on the movie for the whole show. Somehow that's just come up here in our conversation as one of the sources.
And now I have a really bad image of Gettysburg as Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Wow.
Like Buford and drag kind of stuff.
Right,
yeah.
Buford and drag.
Oh, there goes all the Buford people.
John Buford would never dress in drag.
Well, I mean, Sam Elliott would never dress in drag.
Oh, I don't know about that.
So, as we look at bad history, where do you begin? And I think we thought the best way to kind of do it is just sort of go chronologically. The stuff we hear on July 1st, July 2nd, July 3rd, and maybe some kind of overall prevalent myths in the Gettysburg campaign. I saw somebody that made the argument of bad history that Gettysburg is the most decisive battle of the war.
Oh, well,
maybe we end on that one.
So to end or start, since we just brought it out, or
well, maybe if we want to start with
let's start, because then we'll forget to do it at the end, and somebody will say you forgot to address that.
Well, it's always important when we look at where bad history is coming from. Who are the proponents of a lot of bad history? And typically, what I find, and I've done a lot of tours, I've never said Gettysburg is the most decisive battle of the Civil War. I've said it's one of them, and I think you can make that argument. But I think what you see is sites perhaps one that's 50 or so miles southwest of here in Sharpsburg, Maryland.
Okay.
I think another site about 1,000 or so miles from here along the Mississippi River.
Oh, yeah.
They like to claim that sort of, it's all overrated. Gettysburg's overblown. It's not that important, that Vicksburg is more important, Antietam is more important. Well, you can make that case, but I think as we get into, sometimes when it comes to good or bad history, it's also about public perception.
Yeah.
Whether they like it or not, the public views Gettysburg as the most decisive battle of the Civil War. Well, it's certainly the most famous.
Well, this is why something like the movie came up first, right? Because we get a lot of our impressions from popular culture, movies, TV shows, easier to read books. Now, in the last episode, you even said you're starting to prefer podcasts over books. And I'm not there yet. But, popular culture is going to obviously create that myth. No, I think I've always said on my tours or just anywhere where I'm speaking, Gettysburg is one of the decisive moments. I don't think in a 4-year war spanning, the entire country and this many casualties, there isn't a decisive moment. It's a series of events that ultimately lead to the outcome. Yes, Gettysburg is part of it. Yes, Sharpsburg or Antietam or whatever we're calling it tonight is part of it. Vicksburg is part of it. Petersburg is part of it. The Appomattox campaign is part of it. It's all sort of a series. The Civil War is too complex to hinge it all on one event. And I think more than anything, that's how I view it.
Well, and it's also a problem. I think people become almost tribalistic when it comes to their interpretations of the Civil War. Our battle can't be important if your battle is viewed important as well. You can have mutually important events happening at different times in the war. It's okay. It's sort of the same thing we see with pushback about certain Civil War figures. Oh, they're overrated. They get too much attention.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't mean that if light is on someone else that it somehow diminishes yours on someone else. In many cases, it's a team effort one way or the other.
Well, that's not a Civil War thing. All people everywhere are like that.
Yeah. I think, obviously our society, I think, is getting more and more kind of tribalistic on things. So I think that kind of filters into the way we view it. But, I sleep okay if Gettysburg is not the most decisive battle of the Civil War. I'm okay with that.
Well, so you mentioned that too, and frankly, really nothing we're talking about tonight upsets me. I know there are a lot, but I know there are a lot of people who do lose sleep and shout at the sky and, work themselves into a frothy rage when they hear some of the items on our list. I would sleep just fine if Gettysburg was not the decisive moment of the Civil War.
I think it's more of a 1-2 punch. Gettysburg and Vicksburg. You kind of need that left, right at the same time. So we can share.
And sometimes in history, the importance of an event isn't necessarily what happened, but what didn't happen. The fact the Union Army wins a battle in Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863 cannot be overstated in importance, because if the roles are reversed, I'm not going to say the Confederacy wins the war. Right. But things are going to get really hairy really quick.
It's certainly a blow to the Lincoln administration if the Battle of Gettysburg is lost. Or if anything is lost in Pennsylvania, it's certainly a huge blow to the Lincoln administration if that happens. So is that decisive? No. But is it critically important? Hell yes.
And also, we could quibble about what exactly is decisive. There's even some people that say that, to be honest, compared to, say, Napoleonic examples of battles, the Civil War actually had very few, if any, decisive battles by the metric of other wars and other conflicts.
Well, you're right. That sort of notion that somebody's army would have literally been destroyed and that sort of thing. Certainly by 1863, you're probably not in a situation where Lee is going to literally destroy Meade's army or vice versa. It's not going to happen. First of all, it didn't happen, which is the important thing. But are you in a situation here? Even if Lee is hitting the Army of the Potomac in detail. Well, July 1st, right? They smash a couple of corps. And let's say you had gone into a battle here where they just continue to beat up on Meade in detail. Are you really going to destroy the Army? No. The Army of the Potomac, in the worst case scenario, is always going to retreat, fall back to Washington, retool, refight for another day. Again, where I think there's potential decisiveness is, what kind of pressure is put on Lincoln in the event of a Union defeat, and who knows? It didn't happen, so we don't know.
And I think what's very interesting is that students of the Civil War can fall into any number of categories. You can have people that are really more drawn to the military aspects. You have people that are more drawn to the political aspects. And I think sometimes if there's an overemphasis on one over the other, it can skew how we view things. And I think Gettysburg is one of the more decisive political events of the Civil War. Had Lee won here, how do you think gubernatorial elections are going in 1863 in the North? What about 1864, Lincoln's reelection there? Or will Lincoln even be the nominee of the Republican Party in 64? Even with Gettysburg as a victory, there were still questions whether or not Lincoln was going to be on that ticket. So he had a pretty good 1863. Imagine if he loses a battle in Pennsylvania. These are the things that, we don't get into what if history, but I think these are factors that have to be considered, except for our most
highly
listened to episode
popular
ever.
What if Jackson was a Gettysburg episode, but that's beyond the point.
So does that show a lot of people that call what if history bad history actually deep down enjoy what if history?
Or does it mean we were guilty of bad history? Do we need to shine a bright light on ourselves?
Well, is it bad history if you hosted a symposium on it? Because doesn't that make everything good history if it's a symposium?
I was going to say if it's a podcast, right? Because podcasting's where it's at, man, right now.
Well, folks, let's just keep in mind, just because you create historical content does not mean you're a historian.
So I think Jody had something she wanted to say. Jody?
Again, you guys are leaving me speechless. No, I think Gettysburg is the decisive battle now because it's just plain easier to visit and study.
Yes. I'm glad you made that point.
Yeah.
Gettysburg's kind of an easy battle.
It's easy to get to. It's easily marked. and it's easy to study. We don't have all the impediments that a lot of these other battlefields have.
But again, that goes back, right? That goes back to a period, 1880s, 1890s and such, where somebody, and kind of tying somewhat back to our John Batchelder episode, somebody felt Gettysburg was important enough to make that happen. Certainly in terms of studying the battlefield, you're right. You come to Gettysburg, you've got lines of, for the most part, don't break my stones over exceptions, but for the most part at Gettysburg, you've got lines of monuments. It's easy to kind of interpret from that point of view where, where it Antietam, they're kind of all over the place. And if you don't really know that battle, it's harder to figure out. I don't want to do us a disservice by saying Gettysburg is an easy battle to learn, because at one time it wasn't for us and for many of our listeners. I think, as you said before, everybody listening to this show is sort of at a different stage right now. We have some real pros listening, we have some beginners listening, and then we probably have some people in the middle. But it is important to remember that Gettysburg is marked, not because we in the modern era thought it decisive and important, but our forefathers, people way back, the veterans. Well, the veterans, I was thinking more of Batchelder and not so much a veteran, but the veterans, the generation who fought in the Civil War did consider it to be critical, if not decisive.
I always recommend for any students of Gettysburg, the best thing they can sometimes do is stop studying Gettysburg. Go look at other campaigns occasionally. Step outside of the summer of 1863. And the reason why I say Gettysburg is somewhat easy is that there is such a wealth of information. This is the best, well, really in terms of battlefields of any size, this is one of the best preserved battlefields.
Yep.
And this is, I think, the best interpreted battlefield anywhere in the world. Large part because of 140 colleagues like us. But I think what we see is the information is there. When I try to prepare programs for battlefields in the Shenandoah Valley, folks, there is no John Batchelder of Cedar Creek.
I mean, when I did my Chancellorsville tour last year, just numbers, strengths, and losses that we take for granted at Gettysburg wasn't there for Chancellorsville. They're there, but you really have to dig a hell of a lot deeper than you do for Gettysburg.
Even orders of battle in Jubal Early's army. I mean, is this colonel on the battlefield or not?
Yeah.
Well, here at Gettysburg, we pretty much know who is here and in most high-ranking positions. There's some speculation.
Yeah.
And so I think, or my book on Newport Barracks, try researching a battle that no one had ever did a book on before.
Yeah, right.
That is not easy. So I think for a lot of students of the battle, they see all that's out there. It can almost be overwhelming, but also it lends them to, well, I read it in this book. Well, it seems like a good book. Let's just run with it. Ease of information, finding information, does not remove you from the basic challenges of being a historian and analyzing those sources and actually coming up with good interpretations.
And the analysis and the sources is the real problem. That's why I am leery of the proliferation of things like podcasts and that sort of thing. Because if I've got a book in front of me, and yes, I know I'm sounding old school and not cool, man, preferring books over cameras and microphones, but obviously you still have the ability in the book to go back and check that footnote, which with all the digital history that's going on today, you just don't. So that's a danger.
I think it is possible to kind of bridge that gap. I think as much as we do try to tell people the source material where we're coming from.
But I'm not talking about.
And I think that's because we look at this really from the perspective as professional historians. And I'm not saying to be a professional historian, you have to be a battlefield guide or work for the Park Service or teach at a college. No, anybody can be a historian. It's how you go about your craft of history. And that's kind of what I got back to by saying just because you create historical content does not make you a historian of that event. No different than if you just tell a story about a historical event, you're not necessarily a historian either.
Oh, you're a storyteller. Hey, so I feel like, though, in terms of the original idea that is Gettysburg the decisive battle of the Civil War, I feel like maybe we're getting a little down a different rabbit hole with that. So if we come back, though, a little bit, does anybody have a battle that they feel like is a decisive one moment of the Civil War? Does anybody have one? Maybe you do, maybe you don't.
I'll give a plug. Cedar Creek.
Okay.
I knew that was coming.
Well, I mean, and think about the situation you have in the fall of 1864. Lincoln is having some good news. Atlanta's fallen. things are still kind of static at Petersburg.
Right.
But the Shenandoah Valley looks like it's kind of stabilized. And imagine if Jubal Early's army is able to win a victory in mid-October. We often talk about in political campaigns the concept of an October surprise, something that completely upends a campaign. Well, the Confederates winning a victory in the Shenandoah Valley when you're campaigning on the fact that they're pretty much beaten and tired out, that's not going to look good. And could that have been enough to shift enough of that? Who knows? What about the soldiers' vote that went overwhelmingly for Lincoln? So I would say the Shenandoah Valley campaign of 1864, one of the more underappreciated and what I would consider decisive campaigns of the war, but I'm not going to say it's the decisive one.
I'm going to go with First Bull Run, right? The First Bull Run turns out radically differently. You may not have the Civil War as we know it. So I'm going to go with First Bull Run. And again, I kind of just came up with that on the fly. It's not like I go around on tours telling people, folks, you should be down at Manassas.
That was the best battle.
Exactly.
Most decisive.
But again, if you're trying to just cherry pick one, think about what the Civil War looks like if that doesn't happen. Jody, before we move on, do you have one?
I have to go with Antietam.
Yeah? Just because you're from Maryland?
Because I love Maryland, but I think it's a huge political shift. I mean, you see Lincoln actually coming out to the battlefield. There's a change in command. There's a change in political strategy. So that's important.
Yeah, it is. Now, keep in mind, right, so that's fall of 1862.
Right.
War still goes on until spring of 1865. So I have all joking aside with the First Bull Run example, I think Antietam is a turning point, a defining moment, but I'm not ready to call that one the most decisive. But that's just me.
And in full disclosure, we are not Western theater aficionados. Yeah. I mean, I've been to some of those battles, but I think you can make arguments for things like Fort Henry and Donelson, Shiloh. I mean, there's Atlanta, obviously, some people even argue Tullahoma.
Yeah.
There's a lot to say. And what I think we're saying is that it's not one or the other.
Yeah.
It's really a multitude of events that led to the result you got. So I think the idea of, folks that try to bash Gettysburg when people say it's the most decisive, ultimately, I think what they're most upset on is that we just get more visitors and more recognition.
Well, I think there is some of that.
There's some of that in there as well at the end of the day. I remember when I visited...
definitely Gettysburg envy.
I visited Vicksburg. And
That's a new shirt, Gettysburg Envy.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
We could sell them. I know a number of sites we could sell them at.
Including the Battle of Gettysburg.com.
But, I went to Vicksburg a couple years ago. And when I went there, you tell them where you're from. I'm from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The ranger literally said, where they had the failed raid.
Oh, wow.
And my response was, and probably 3 times your visitation.
Right.
So, I think once again, it's fun, but I think when you have kind of fun poking the bear back and forth, it eventually turns into, anything related to Gettysburg isn't that important. Right, tell that to the guys that fought here.
Well, let's go. Yeah. And if we move on to specific topics related to Gettysburg, I think I can think of one that's going to come back again. All right. So how about what I felt like in our Ask the Fans vote here, what I think was, we didn't do a scientific count because, as we said, there were hundreds of replies, but shoes clearly seemed to be the most, I think, were probably the most popular notion. So again, this is a good example of one. Folks, as much as we like to ridicule the shoes story, we like to ridicule the notion that there was no shoe factory at Gettysburg. There is that kernel of historic truth in that, of which this tree of myth and bad history has sprouted. And I think we've probably said it on other episodes before, but for example, it comes from Henry Heath's report.
Old Harry Heath.
My boys, they got the danda up. And so as he says, quote, on the morning of June 30th, I ordered Brigadier General Pettigrew to take his brigade to Gettysburg, search the town for army supplies, parentheses, shoes especially, close parentheses, and return the same day. All right. So there's sort of where that starts. It doesn't mean the battle was fought over shoes. However, again, I'll come back to somebody like Shelby Foote. Look, because Foote's works are immensely popular and have been read by millions of people. People like Shelby then kind of took that to the next level that, hey, do you have any objections if I go to Gettysburg to get those shoes? None in the world kind of thing. Shelby, kind of added to get those shoes to the conversation, and millions of people have read that. Millions of people grew up on that with their Civil War indoctrination, and over time, the Battle of Gettysburg was fought because of shoes. So it's a great example of a kernel of truth kind of turning into a popcorn bucket of misinformation.
And this would not be the first time that people really kind of crave simple answers for very complex events.
It's the human condition, Eric.
Yeah,
people want the meaning of life. They want simple answers.
Like the idea,
on the battlefield.
We like the idea that it's shoes that caused this battle. Well, what is one of Robert E. Lee's primary objectives, and I would even argue his top objective for coming into Pennsylvania, is to gather supplies.
Right.
Well, if you have an army, they need shoes.
Yeah.
Ask any infantryman today what is the most important thing you have. It's ultimately your feet and maintaining them.
Sure.
And it's not just the Confederate Army that's going to need shoes in this campaign. After the campaign, Meade has a requisition for tens of thousands of shoes to be going to Frederick, Maryland. So armies need shoes. So if they can procure it while here, by all means. And also keep in mind, by the time the Confederate Army is here in South Central Pennsylvania, where have they marched from?
Sure.
The Fredericksburg area. What's happening to their feet? They're wearing down.
Yeah.
And so it's not unreasonable.
No, it's not unreasonable at all. And again, you talk about bad history. You think about Jubal Early coming through here a few days earlier, ransoming the shoes, really coming away empty-handed. And people are like, oh my God, he should have known that Early did that. Well, why would he?
Yeah.
Why would he? And as far as the lack of instantaneous communication, but, he says supplies and shoes. I mean, that's basically what he's telling us. So it's a broader range of supplies that, obviously does include the footwear. So not only does a guy like Foote, and I know others have, kind of perpetuate that, but I've seen some people even accuse Foote. Is it ironic? Foote and shoes?
Yeah.
I never thought of that before. But I have seen some people kind of use the shoes brought on the Battle of Gettysburg as kind of a way of perpetuating a lost cause, sort of. These boys, these poor ragged boys.
No shoes on.
Exactly. They're all coming in with no shoes on. And again, I've never really perpetuated that, but I've seen other people accuse other people of kind of perpetuating that myth because of the lack of shoes.
Then that also makes everybody think that the Union Army, like you said, was well dressed. They had shoes. They had everything they needed, and they came in here ready to go. But they were looking for supplies too.
The overwhelming production capabilities of the North, kind of thing.
And then these poor, haggard Confederates came up. They didn't have a chance, and that's just not.
And what we see before the campaign, Lee, as best he can, reprovisions his army, new uniforms when he can, new flags, new weapons, as best he can. Also, the spoils of Chancellorsville are being circulated through the army. But I think what we see is if you look at any army on the march, what they look at when they leave to what they look like in the middle of a campaign are two totally different things. And I would argue everybody coming into Pennsylvania is looking haggard.
Well, you're right.
They're all getting worn out.
You're right. I would agree. And I think we talked a little bit in the Kent Masterson Brown episodes. I think one of the things Brown did well in his Meade at Gettysburg book was kind of reminded many people how haggard the Army of the Potomac was and how challenging it was for the Army of the Potomac to get supplied. I think that's one of the great things KMB does in his Meade book.
And I would argue, I think someone that really does get some blame for perpetuating the shoes.
Dan Sickles?
No, not Dan Sickles, because he only needs a shoe.
Exactly.
See what I did there? Did you know Sickles lost a leg?
I just gave you that. But did you know he didn't have a leg to stand on?
Didn't see that one coming.
Bad joke.
Can we do like a commercial break here?
Never.
Bad jokes.
Never.
Let's take a brief pause to thank tonight's sponsor, Getty's Gear. You can find them in Gettysburg at 777 Baltimore Pike or always online at gettysgear.com. They have gourmet coffee, cigars, dog treats, stuffies for your kids, and much, much more. So stop by and see our friends at Getty's Gear. Support them like they support us. A little delay.
But if you look at Henry Heath, one source that I really like, really for entertainment value, is Henry Heath's memoir.
Yeah.
And what Heath will do when he is putting together his memoir years later is he goes back to his wartime papers.
Mm-hmm.
What did you write about? Which is what anybody does when they're writing an autobiography or a memoir. You go back to what you had.
I know that's what I do.
Yeah. I mean, when I'm preparing my autobiography, I go back to my files from certain periods, you know, and it keeps you honest.
The podcasting years, for example. Yeah.
So what I think we see is later in Heath's memoir, he really doubles down on this shoe thing. It really makes it more important. And what you have is this kind of avalanche building where it starts as what's in an OR report. And now it gets a little bigger in a memoir after the war. And then it gets kind of carried on by a popular historian.
Right.
That then kind of perpetuates it even more. So I think there's the people that will say, can you believe the ridiculous stuff that people say shoes even had anything to do with the Battle of Gettysburg? Yeah. They did.
It absolutely did.
It's not the cause.
Right.
But it's what has the Army of Northern Virginia on the way to Gettysburg on the morning of June 30th and July 1st.
Dare I say it's not the most decisive moment in what is not the most decisive battle, but I agree with you. It is a cause, right? And then obviously that then steamrolls into something else because as we well know from this show, Pettigrew encounters Buford on the outskirts of town. Pettigrew goes back to Cashtown. Pettigrew reports what he has seen, blah, blah, blah. And basically they say, okay, let's come back tomorrow in force. And I did just kind of want to bring up one comment there because then what I think that kind of ties to as well is, and again, a line from the movie that I'm thinking of right now. General Heath is going to go to Gettysburg. He only expects to encounter some local militia with shotguns and such. Right? Which is now kind of a great first day myth that the Army of Northern Virginia comes up here only expecting to find the local militia. Right? And if you go back to Heath's report, and I'm intentionally going to the report rather than the memoirs, he says, it may not be improper for me to remark that I was ignorant what force was at or near Gettysburg, and supposed it consisted of cavalry, most probably supported by a brigade or two of infantry. So again, even if he doubles down later in his, moderately contemporary report, he's not saying, well, I thought we were only going to find militia with shotguns and such, right? He's saying we saw cavalry the day before, and maybe we were hoping they would be supported by light infantry, a small number of infantry and kind of push them aside. So the militia bad history is what I'm throwing on the table.
And then you get the famous account where supposedly some Confederate, and you'll sometimes see it's from the 26th North Carolina, or you'll see it from someone in Archer's brigade where they'll say, "Tain't no militia, that's them black-hatted fellers," which of course is just more Iron Brigade propaganda to assume that the Iron Brigade's the only unit that fights on July 1st, but I digress.
Well, before
and totally win the first day.
Before you digress, just reminding folks of the very successful 26th North Carolina versus 24th Michigan tour we did on the field this summer while we were, away on a podcasting hiatus doing beloved field programs.
So what we get into is, okay, what slows Henry Heath down? Well, it's the 2,700 or so troopers of John Buford. Well, the only way that they could have held back a more or less 7,000-man division is that they must have had superior firepower. And of course, we all know that every Union trooper on this battlefield was equipped with a Spencer's repeating carbine / rifle / machine gun / whatever you want to use.
Howitzer tank,
/ tactical nuke, whatever they've got that keeps them back. But are there repeating rifles in the Army of the Potomac, Jim?
I got to speak here.
You got to come in here. All right. I'll give you the hot tag. Here's the hot tag.
Yeah, that we just did the tag here into the ring here as I come over the top ropes. So, couple thoughts here. So if shoes was the number one fan selection, I would say close behind it was the idea of repeating rifles. Quick anecdote. Because I do a lot of cavalry tours. I do a lot of Custer stuff. I do a lot of Buford, East Cav Cav, South Cav. Dare I say, I'm all over the field.
You were East Cav before East Cav was cool.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to let people know who was one of the ones doing one of the original field programs out there now. Just letting people know.
He's the OG of East Cav.
The OG of ECF. I like that. So, but anyways, but first of all, thank you for that. But I digress. Here's the thing, though. I swear to God, and I've even now added it into my tours as a joke, and now I'll do it on the podcast, and the joke will be ruined, kind of thing.
Because everybody will steal it from you.
Pretty much, okay. Yeah. But
like the tours.
But I swear. But I swear to God. So first of all, to answer Eric's question, who is the only regiment at Gettysburg fully armed with Spencer rifles, repeating rifles? That is, of course, the 5th Michigan of Custer's Michigan Cavalry Brigade. And every time we tell that story, I take people out to the skirmish line out near the Rommel Farm, and we do that. Someone will always interrupt and say, no, Buford had repeating rifles. And then you'll explain, no, he didn't. He had single shot carbines. He did not have repeating rifles. No, I know he did. And again, if I'm not mistaken, and I hate to keep bagging on the same guy, I think this is another Shelby Foote moment for popularizing this, if I'm not mistaken. I think he did.
Well, and what I think happens is this is where, are there repeating rifles here at Gettysburg?
Yep.
Yes. Are there a lot of them? No.
Correct.
Do most Union mounted forces, if not pretty much all of them, are they equipped with pretty, at least decent carbines of some kind, breech loading weapons for the most part? And of course, I'm sure there's probably some obscure company somewhere that doesn't. But for the most part in the Army of the Potomac, they at least have a carbine, a breech loading carbine, which gives you a higher rate of fire than the typical rifled musket.
And obviously easier to use on horseback versus trying to ramrod your rifled musket while keeping old Trigger, the horse in check. But I was just going to add to that too, because you're right, and I'll take a part B to that. I've also increasingly had people then interrupt me a second time and say, no, they had repeating rifles at the Peach Orchard. I know because a friend of mine metal detected out there, kind of stuff. And I'm like, dude, I wrote a book on the Peach Orchard. I think if a regiment had Gettysburg's Peach Orchard, co-written with Britt Eisenberg.
I'll check that one out.
But again, it's like, no, to your point, are there repeating rifles on the field? Yes, but there's only that one regiment fully armed, and it is indeed the 5th Michigan.
And what becomes Custer's brigade, they passed through Gettysburg before the battle.
Yeah.
So it already puts them here. They would have been passing through that general vicinity. Not to mention on the pursuit of Lee. Folks, guys serve as couriers. I have an account of someone that I think served with Buford that got temporarily attached to Sickles as essentially a runner.
Yeah.
So that happens. So, I mean, we have to be careful how we look at these things. And also there is, in 1864, Union mounted forces in the Shenandoah Valley with their repeating rifles were a decisive component. 3rd Winchester as well as Cedar Creek. Also, any of Tom Rosser's skirmishing, Tom's Brook, things like that. Yes, we have a lot of names that we hear later there. Does that, I think, kind of morph back here to they have them in 64? They're decisive. Does it maybe somehow just be like this little brain worm?
I don't know. I really feel like a lot of the quote unquote popular history really is more that they were decisive at Gettysburg and specifically with Buford. And so, what I'll ask is, I think, kind of a natural segue. So what? Who cares how Buford's guys are armed? Is it an impression, though, that they just have this overwhelming firepower that they're pumping off, 7 rounds in a clip against Heath's advancing men?
Just from listening to a lot of interpretation on the battlefield, I think a lot of people want Buford to be this hero and have the superior firepower because he's Buford. He's going to save the day.
Would he be more heroic, though, with less firepower?
I think, though, it makes Buford almost like a Rambo figure.
Yeah.
Right.
He's got the machine gun on his side. And he's just taking out an entire platoon on his
rifle
own.
in each arm with the bandana around it.
Yeah, I think that's, can we get somebody to make a special commission print of that? I want that as a velvet painting hanging in my house.
People are talking about Buford. That's what they're picturing.
Well, and how easy would it be to confuse repeating with I don't know, rapid fire or increased fire. Those are, honestly, I'm the guy that got points taken off on it when he was becoming a battlefield guide for using the term entrenchments.
Yeah, I remember that.
So there isn't, terms can get kind of confused. Or how many times have you had people say, okay, what's the deal between a rifle and a musket?
Yeah.
And I almost have to say, by this point, they're interchangeable.
Yeah.
You have rifled muskets, or you have rifles being referred to as muskets.
Or the difference between the carbine and the repeating rifle.
Yeah, so I think there's a tendency for sometimes the jargon to get a little confused.
I don't see. I get interrupted enough that I don't think the interrupting people are confused over the jargon. I think they really think this.
So are you saying there's sometimes people on tours that like to try to get their moment of fame by showing up the guide on a tour? Does that happen?
And then doubling down by saying they metal detected.
When you're wrong, first thing to do is double down.
Yep, exactly.
I believe it was Dan Sickles that once said, often wrong, but never in doubt.
Yeah.
Or if he didn't, he should have.
And if he didn't, he should have. Yeah, I think so. I think there was a lot of that. And like I said, in the big scheme of things, what the hell difference does it make?
Right.
But it's a great example. I mean, obviously, our listeners called it out as most popular myth number 2, and I can say from experience, I get interrupted by this all of the freaking time.
I'm surprised though.
About which?
The day one popularity. I really am.
Well, myths often are kind of associated with origin stories.
Yeah,
is this not? Is that not the origin of the Battle of Gettysburg? So it's natural. Even going into who fires the first shot, who fires the first artillery round, who fires the first regimental volley.
Right.
These are all things that I think people have a tendency, you want to be the first.
The OG of the OG,
Are we going to start calling Marcellus Jones the OG of Knoxland Ridge?
Well, now that it's on the podcast, now that it's on the podcast, though, everybody's going to be saying that. So you've already shot your load.
I can't wait the next time I tune into Instagram and see someone filming on the battlefield and refers to Marcellus Jones, the OG of Knoxland Ridge. I want royalties. So, but I think that's the day one. I think has a lot of these myths.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And we find it in any number of areas.
Yeah.
I wonder, does day one per capita have the most myths of any day of the battle?
Maybe, but I'll tell you what, when I was just sort of putting a mental list together in my own head, boy, day 3's got a lot of them too.
That's what I would thought.
Yeah.
We have the Doubleday Archer incident.
Yep.
We have
that didn't happen?
We have the Barlow Gordon incident. We have Lane McConnell, 24th Michigan, 26th North Carolina. How many different sharpshooters shot John Reynolds? I think day one lends itself to a lot of that.
Maybe.
But I think you're right. Day 3 has, I think day 3, how much of that is bad history and myth, or is it maybe even sometimes a little bit of an embellishment of what goes on?
I think sometimes. You know what I think part of what's going on is first day gets embellished. First day gets embellished because people want to find these reasons and these explanations for why this thing kicks off the way it kicks off. Third day, then, I think, gets embellished in a lot of ways because, again, people want to find these myths and these reasons to explain why it happens, explain that final outcome. Yeah, and day 2,
it's just a mess.
Yeah, day 2 is just a hot mess. Right. The day of Dan Sickles is just a hot mess.
Well, and I think, we have every facet of the battle that has these myths or this bad history that gets brought in. And I think we also have to keep in mind today, at this exact moment, as I say this, we have more information available on the Battle of Gettysburg than any other time in history. And I'm going to say that 5 minutes later because somebody probably just posted a letter online that's now increased our knowledge. So this is a very dated comment by the time you hear this. So I think what we have to do is really track all of them down to kind of where do they come from? Where are they starting from?
Are you saying we're going to start tracking down every Gettysburg source? Did I just hear that correctly?
No,
Somebody else maybe want to do that?
Well,
I don't want to do
take your time.
Jody, can we assign that one to you?
Expedition Unknown, but Gettysburg.
Yeah, I want you to get me every Gettysburg primary source account, and
Gettysburg
you got a month and a half.
Jody, take the staff interns under your wing and kind of come back to us in a month with
research
that.
department.
Yeah. But too, is I'm a big little bighorn guy, and you could kind of argue who has more there. But anyways, I digress.
And also, we have to. I think one thing that a lot of students of the battle I think don't fully appreciate is how the interpretation of this battle has shifted. There are very sort of distinct eras that we talk about this. And sometimes what happens is interpretation shifts because new sources become available. And, case in point, I was reading a book on the Battle of Midway. And it was from the Japanese perspective that a lot of original histories of it did not have access to the Japanese side of things. So when you read what the enemy's doing, well, that changes maybe some of the things that happen on our end. So a lot of this early history of the battle is shaped by the Union veterans themselves, in large part because of John Batchelder. But we begin to see things shifting, though, around the early 1900s because who's coming back more to the battlefield now? It's Confederates. They're marking the field. They're starting to at least put some monuments up. And then we sort of get things where it kind of ebbs and flows. Longstreet's a villain. Longstreet's a hero. But I think it's very important to understand the shifting nature of this interpretation here. And many people, I don't think, do that sometimes.
Well, part of that's societal as well. Because, I mean, if you look at recent histories of the Battle of Gettysburg, they tend to focus more on human interest. There's more civilian stories in there. They're trying to meet what is our current definition of the full story. Whereas 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it was more military. It was more male dominated. Maybe some of it was more tactics and combat. Sort of thing, where now they're trying to cover everything from intelligence gathering to the civilian experience to the weather, everything.
Back to location too, because if the battlefield preservation has changed as well. I mean, look at how Devil's Den used to look about 30 years ago.
You mean like how it still does? Or
no, like 30 years ago when it was full of trees.
I'm still waiting for the Park Service to turn up the evidence that showed why there's so much damn corn on the battlefield right now. I'm just asking if they can show me that document that shows why we have so much corn keeping in its historical spot. Please forward that to me. But you mentioned something, too, where you said the real history or the complete history. Yeah. I think we can say with a lot of certainty that any history related to Gettysburg that has the following in it: the true story, the real story, or the unknown story, it may or may not be bad. Plan. Yeah, I think, when it starts to sound like a cheesy reality TV show, be careful. But there's sometimes don't totally throw it away.
Jenny Wade and General Lee and the Hidden Gold. That's not real.
Actually, we're actually vetting that that.
Yeah, that's next week's episode.
You just broke kayfabe. Wow.
So a couple things there, because I sometimes will comment on this on social media, because I see a lot of people will criticize, any book that starts with Lee's real plan sort of thing. You got to take that with a grain of salt, though, because, authors are not necessarily responsible for the title of their books.
This is true.
The Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg book that I co-wrote with Wayne, to be honest, and Steve Stanley, to be honest, I wanted a different title. So sometimes you can't throw the baby out with that, but you got to really look at who the author is, the credentials. And, when you pick up that book in the bookshop, or again, you can't when you order it on Amazon today, look at the bibliography, look at how many footnotes there are, look at how many sources there are, and that will hopefully help guide you towards a more informed version of, quote unquote, good history.
And I think that is a concern I see, that a lot of people equate getting a book, reading something out of that book, and posting it online or making a video of it or even a podcast of it, that is somehow doing historic research. It's really not. I mean, if you're going into the archives, if you're spending time with the primary sources, that's actual research. And I think we have to be aware that, I always say the best way to judge a book, like you said, is by its bibliography. Now, it could be a flaming dumpster fire of a book by the time I read it, but at least if the sources are good, I'm going to give it a shot. And I think one of the things I would say is look at the same locations where people are doing research. Are they going to the National Archives?
Yeah.
Are they going to the University of Michigan, the University of North Carolina, Duke University? I mean, the various state archives, are they really digging through to see that? That's how you tell if it's good or not. And so I think that's a good way to kind of avoid bad history. Maybe that can be our public service announcement.
I mean, a good way to try to avoid the bad history. I'd agree with you on that. And in the case of a guy like Shelby Foote, damn, he's a good writer. And we all know he's a great writer. We all know that. He was a great speaker, and that's why he enchanted the world with Ken Burns. And, we haven't really bagged on the Ken Burns show.
We have not.
Should we?
I mean, my gosh, is that a whole episode of bad history? history?
Well, I think we've talked about, doing the Ken Burns rewatch kind of since we started. But in the interest of time here, because look, folks, Eric and I and Jody, we love to talk. We could easily drag this out for 6 hours. We kind of said beforehand that this one would just be like volume 1 of bad history.
And really, we haven't even gotten to day 2 or day 3.
Why don't we move on to July 2nd? You want to do that?
Yeah, let's move in, I think.
Well, before we do, though, I just want to shout out, I know a lot of the listeners did have other great July 1st suggestions. We'll keep them in our files, keep them in the archives. We'll come back when we do volume 2.
Believe me, as long as stuff is being produced about Gettysburg, there will always be bad history. It's like running a funeral home. You will never go out of business.
So July 2nd, obviously the original bad history was Longstreet's Sunrise Attack Order.
Right.
I still get people on tour who will occasionally say, that Longstreet was dragging his feet, type of thing. I think the Sunrise Attack Order, though, as a thing, has been mostly demolished by good historians. So I don't know is there anything you guys want to talk about on that? If not, I'm going to kind of go to like little round top. I mean, I
think
like
one of the things that I think interests me is how prevalent it was.
Sure.
And I think that also goes to the influence that Jubal Early is going to have on this battle, being one of the key proponents. But I think
it goes back to the movie.
It goes back, I think it goes
even earlier. But then I think the movie really reinforces the pouting Longstreet.
You think?
And puts that image in people's heads. Yeah.
Well, it is.
He's kind of stoic. And
when we look at this, one of the things that the more I've gotten kind of involved in researching the 1864 Shenandoah Valley campaign, is that as vehement as Jubal Early is against others here at Gettysburg for failing, in many ways, he's projecting for the same venom that he was getting from people like John Gordon at Cedar Creek and others. So we forget that Early's fighting his own Longstreet-like battle in the Shenandoah Valley with historical memory.
Well, there's a bigger thing there, though, with historical memory. We tend to think all the debates and the historical memory was only Gettysburg centric.
Right. It's not.
Every battle has it. Every battle has it. Every campaign has it. Every major battle, every major campaign has it. Whether it's D.H. Hill arguing about something in Maryland or, Rosecrans or
D.H.
whoever.
Hill arguing about something?
Exactly.
When does he ever do that?
Right. But the point being too is we tend to think like, oh, Jubal Early spent his whole life banging on Longstreet for Gettysburg. Jubal Early had a full and robust life banging on a lot of people and in some cases getting banged on himself.
And I think that's where, once again, having a broader view of this helps you. I think people do get way too Gettysburg centric. I mean, you mentioned earlier about the repeating rifles. Who cares?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of things that ultimately these debates, end of the day, does it really matter?
No, it doesn't.
Does it fundamentally change the way we view the battle?
No.
If we know where Captain Johnston went, does it fundamentally change this battle?
Not really.
If we find where the harvest of death is, does it fundamentally change this battle?
It becomes a scavenger hunt for a lot of people too.
And I appreciate that. I mean, everybody loves a good quest, a good adventure, but I think we have to be careful sometimes from equating trivia with really important information.
Well, back to, the idea of getting the broader view, because I dealt with that a lot when I wrote my Sickles book, because you go into a topic like that, and all you've ever heard your whole Gettysburg life is all Dan Sickles did was spend the rest of his life trying to demolish George Meade. You hear that all the time. Sickles spent the rest of his life trying to demolish Meade. And when you go in and you look at the last 50 years of Sickles' life, guess what? He's doing a lot of other stuff. Women, money, politics.
Great segue there.
Exactly.
I like how you led with that one.
He's leading a full life. He's not focusing on Meade.
Robust life. He's not focusing on Meade. But people get so Gettysburg centric. They go for that one soundbite. Sickles spent the rest of his life trying to demolish Meade, and they literally think he spent every waking moment for the next 50 years doing that. And I've done a lot of Longstreet research over the years. You're absolutely right. Longstreet and Jubal Early did not spend the rest of their lives writing letters about each other. They actually did other stuff.
Yeah.
People should remember that.
And also, I think we almost think that these generals after the battle were sitting on their computer or their cell phone waiting for the next comment to post on social media. So they have to get their pithy remarks back.
Can you imagine Jubal Early on Twitter?
Oh, my God. Jubal Early would be the greatest troll ever.
He would be.
He wouldn't care.
No.
I mean, and actually, I would kind of appreciate that.
Kind of like the equivalent of the Iron Sheik, who, frankly, we don't talk enough about on this show.
No, we do not talk enough about the Sheik.
And just in case anyone's confused, he's one of our Kung Fu karate heroes.
Yes, he was a master in Kung Fu.
Exactly.
But I think when we look at this, is that their lives were varied. And I mean, there would be periods where, is Longstreet's main focus arguing with Jubal Early? Sure. But then he goes on to other stuff.
Arguing with other guys.
The feud is not constant.
Right.
It dies down and then it flares up again.
It's
kind
of
of
like,
on.
It's not different from wrestling, you know?
Yes.
Potentially, sometimes you go to another territory for a little while. Yep. Sometimes the gate might be down a little bit, so maybe you engage in a feud with another guy. Civil War feuds were exactly the same way.
And I think the bad history is perpetuated because people want a bad guy to blame.
And
they want a hero.
Good.
So it's very easy to kind of make somebody the scapegoat, not their hero, General Lee. He couldn't have been wrong.
No.
It's easier to blame Longstreet or Sickles because they have character flaws.
That's a great point. And heroes, people wanting heroes. Should we go to Chamberlain and Little Round
I think let's talk about Chamberlain because we did have a couple comments.
Yeah.
Where people were saying the idea that Joshua Chamberlain, any variation, saved the United States, won the battle, saved the Union line, on and on and on. I've not heard anybody on the field say that Chamberlain won the Battle of Gettysburg by what he did. I've not heard that.
Yeah.
It might be said. I've never heard it.
Yeah.
Now, I could see some other less credentialed guides and I don't want to use the term interpreter, they're interpreter cosplayers, but they might say that to over embellish it. But does Chamberlain play a critical role in holding Little Round Top? Yes, he does.
Yeah.
Is he the whole reason it's held? No. And really, if you go back to listen to our special episode, The Myth of Little Round Top, of our good friend, Superfan Gary
from, I forget where Gary's living these days.
Somewhere. Well, he's always on the move.
Right.
Honestly, isn't Gary's home where he lays his hat every night?
Exactly.
I mean, he's on the road.
From parts unknown.
I think we're going to say from parts unknown, Gary, Superfan Gary. But I think what we
love you, buddy.
I think, we're doing sound effects now. All right. Our budget's increased. So, I think it is. I don't know why there is this desire to want to tear Chamberlain down because, I mean, honestly, in terms of Civil War figures that should probably be torn down and ripped to shreds, I wouldn't put Chamberlain. He's not my first round pick there.
Here's the thing. Right. Here's the thing. And boy, where do we go with this?
And is it also pushback on the way to kind of show you're cool? The movie's full of crap. Is it maybe some pushback on all the attention he got?
I think there's a little bit of that. I don't think it's pushback on the movie because, you see a lot of quote unquote movie people perpetuating it. This one has always puzzled me a little bit too. And I've said on the show many times, I've been saying on tours for 20 years, I'm not a Chamberlain basher. If you want to find a Chamberlain basher, go find somebody else sort of thing. Did Chamberlain embellish his own record a little bit in some of his writings? Yes. Did every one of our Civil War heroes do that?
Yes.
Yes. Have military figures been more or less doing that since the beginning of time? Yes. I could go on and on. Do political figures do that? Do podcasters embellish?
Yeah.
I could go on. My point being, Chamberlain, for many people of his era, was the real deal. You see newspaper accounts from veterans reunions and gatherings. And yes, he had that whole debate with guys like Ellis Spear. Was Chamberlain, because he was only commander of the 20th Maine for a short time, did he, quote unquote, and I'm making air quotes, did he, quote unquote, take too much credit? That's sort of a debate for a different time. But he was definitely revered by many veterans, and people wanted him at reunions because he was considered a Civil War hero. Now, you get some 20th Maine centric histories, Pullen's book, and some others, that come out in the 1950s and the 1960s era. Once again, gets latched onto by popular history. the Killer Angels, gets latched onto by Ken Burns, gets latched onto by the movie and all of that stuff. And I think, what's a shame is Little Round Top is important, but some of that stuff perpetuated it like Little Round Top saved the Union. And of course it didn't. It didn't. We all know that. But then you got to have the guy who presented as saved as Little Round Top. So yes, now let's all bag on him, and I don't think Chamberlain deserves that.
And I think in many cases, when I find an interpretation that has absolutely no nuance in it whatsoever, it's usually problematic.
Yeah.
I mean, there are very few absolutes
in
life and in history.
Right. Certainly not in life.
And I think if you read, even you mentioned when the veterans come back to dedicate their monuments, if you ever read some of the speeches given there, oh my gosh, those guys are, I mean,
well, that's the thing.
There is no care given to the truth. I mean, how many regiments here on this battlefield will claim by their stand it somehow saved the battle here, and by doing so saved the Union and
exactly
civilization as we know it?
Everyone does that in every speech, in every book. They all do it.
And I've read them from other battles, and guess what, folks? They do them there too. I mean, it's what they do. So I think you have to be very careful. You have to also look at the context of when that was given. I mean, is a guy in front of his comrades maybe want to say something a little rah-rah in front of the boys? Yeah, sure. Yeah. If you read that today as a historian, you go, oh my gosh, how dare he get off saying that? Well, it's also the context of when it's given. It's when it's given that matters.
Well, and so you got to take this back to Little Round Top, because Chamberlain's part of Little Round Top. Little Round Top is important to the Battle of Gettysburg. A friend of mine says, we've been bashing Little Round Top now for so long, it almost becomes the only piece of high ground in the Civil War that doesn't seem to mean anything, because people got sick of the attention from the movie. They got sick of the attention from the Killer Angels. And like we do with everything else, it became so popular that we wanted to tear it down. Folks, July 2nd, Lee and Longstreet's main attack is against the Union left, not the Union right. That makes Little Round Top, Devil's Den, Peach Orchard, anything on that part of the fields potentially historic, significant from a historic point of view. Did Lee identify Little Round Top as the objective of the attack? Of course not. And I think most people today know that. But he was trying to drive in the Union left, which does make Little Round Top important. So I kind of feel like where I'm going with all this, what used to be bad history that Little Round Top saved the Union is now bad history that Little Round Top is unimportant. And to me, that's just as bad as the other that we had for all those years.
Well, and it becomes this idea of your team Little Round Top or your team Culp's Hill. Yeah. And, Little Round Top's closed now, folks. When I do tours on Culp's Hill, I don't see all these Culp's Hill people flocking over to it anymore. Where are they? I thought all these people...
They're lost in the weeds.
Yeah,
they're there. They're cutting
all
their
these
way
people
through the jungle.
Supposedly say that, if you're Culp's Hill people, stand your ground, literally. But, I think what we see is... If you're George Meade, do you want a circumstance where you lose Little Round Top?
Right.
I don't think you do.
No, he said he didn't.
I mean,
it doesn't matter what you or I think. He said he didn't want to lose it.
And does it matter to the guys that are up there getting shot at? You damn right it does.
Damn right it does.
And so I think we have to. I don't think anybody that touts Little Round Top was necessarily saying, "Oh yeah, Little Round Top's the best. Screw those guys over on Culp's Hill." Nobody ever says that. I think it's something we read into it that we want to have one or the other, and they're both critical. The flanks of an army matter no matter what battle you look at. Right. And I'm sorry, the flank of the Union Army more or less rests on Little Round Top.
The left does.
So, I mean, there you go.
Yeah, so I think our point there, folks, is... bashing Little Round Top can almost be as bad as overpraising, overemphasizing Little Round Top. Nuance. You want to find the truth in the middle on that. Little Round Top's important. Culp's Hill is important. And then back to the Chamberlain thing. No, we're definitely not saying Chamberlain saved the Union. That would be a great example.
And has Chamberlain ever said he saved the Union? I've never seen that. I mean, I think I would have come across that if a guy said I saved the Union.
Right. I'm so busy getting in great deeds something abides shoved down my throat. I have no idea what else the guy ever said.
All right.
And don't call me, was it Lawrence or
Don't
whatever?
call me Lawrence.
Yeah. But in great deeds, something abides. That's a piece of history I wouldn't mind going away for a little bit. Find something else. The guy wrote a lot. I'm sure there's other stuff he said that's quotable.
And now I hope after I said that he probably never said I saved the Union. Somebody's
looking for it right now.
Oh my God, I've been waiting my whole life to prove this guy wrong. Yeah. Well, whatever. But I think what we see with Chamberlain is, once again, it goes back to if the spotlight is on somebody else, it doesn't mean that it's diminished on others.
Right.
And you know what? If you don't like Chamberlain, if you don't like Little Round Top, folks, it's easy just to not pay attention to it.
And there's plenty of other bad history on day two.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of other areas you can go if you don't like this. So I think there's a tendency, the almost bashing gets kind of tiresome.
More than almost. It's bashing.
And nobody knows more than you. I mean, my gosh, how long have you been beaten up over Dan Sickles?
Yeah, right. I mean, I've made a two-fisted career over Sickles and Custer, right? And you're right. I mean, it's just sort of the constant one-dimensional bashing and that sort of thing. But the Chamberlain piece, like, I have a friend who thinks all we do as battlefield guides is give Joshua Chamberlain tours, because he thinks he's still got this 1991 movie mentality in his head, and he thinks that's all we do. And as you said kind of at the outset, not really. I don't. There's a whole lot of tours where we just bypass that 20th main position altogether. It really does, in a lot of cases, depend on the needs of the visitor or the desires to see it or not see it. And I think today, less people want to see that than they did 20, 25, 30 years ago. And
we have been now as guides having to deal with Little Round Top being closed. Yeah. There are a lot of people going, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? I mean, Little Round Top's closed. Well, I've not had anyone complain on a tour yet that, I'm really upset with your tour because you couldn't take me to Little Round Top. People are disappointed it's closed. Yeah. I mean, no different than when you go to the water slide and it's closed and you want to go down the water slide. But it's, I think, the same thing with this, that people aren't really, there's not this outrage that it's closed. Or when Devil's Den was closed, we did just fine.
Yeah, right.
And now there's others that are having maybe some more problems with interpretation.
Maybe they're just distracted by the beavers.
Maybe the beaver.
Maybe.
Are the beavers bad history?
Oh, yeah. Do we really want to open this can of beavers? Do we really want to do that?
Or should we just leave it
I
there?
think we should leave it to beaver.
Exactly. Beavers are bad history. Plum Run did not look like a lake during the Battle of Gettysburg. This is bad history.
Although I do like the idea of Texans and Alabamians and basically Higgins boats coming across Plum Run and hitting Little Round Top and going up like the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. That would be pretty cool.
I don't know. I can't swim. Get me. Yeah.
With all the Yankees have all their repeating rifles up there. Kick ass that would look on screen.
Yeah. But back to Little Round Top being closed, right? This is an opportunity from an interpretive point of view to basically set up that water slide at Mount Sickles, which I'm talking about is the peach orchard.
Wait, didn't William Tipton try to do that once?
Yeah, and got his ass kicked by Sickles for that. Oh, should we talk about bad history with William Tipton?
You were a little fired up about Tipton. So, he's not necessarily a day two figure, but I think he's most associated, at least with his with his actions on the southern end of the battlefield.
Yeah, sure.
So let's I think that's how we can bring him into this story.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and this came up on Facebook too, that I said, look, if you're talking about bad history and popular history, right? People today seem to revere William Tipton, the photographer. And look, without his record of battlefield photographs, there's so much we would not know about the early era of commemorating this park. But we treat this guy like a hero because all he knew how to do was operate his camera. So what?
And take pictures of dead bodies.
And take the, well, he didn't
even do that.
Right.
Whoops. Stuff is falling here in the studio. We're throwing stuff in the studio here.
That's the ghost of Tipton.
Well, Tipton's so much, but you know what Tipton...
Well, he probably didn't see where he was going because he was blinded by all the chemicals.
Yeah, I wasn't going to bring that up.
That's why I didn't see where he was going.
But he sets up Tipton Park, he dynamites rocks in Devil's Den, destroys and desecrates the battlefield.
And devastation that is still there.
William Tipton was no hero. Now, thankfully, one man stood up to him at the dedication of the 44th New York Monument on Little Round Top. And of course, that man was Dan Sickles. And Sickles and Butterfield and their henchmen beat the living hell out of Tipton. They smashed his camera. I don't know if they beat the hell out of him, but in my tours, they beat the hell out of him.
If you want to get a sense of what that beatdown looked like,
did he take off his leg?
Well, when I envision, if you want to have a artistic rendering of what this looks like, go back and when the Horsemen break Dusty Rhodes' ankle in the Omni.
See, we are so simpatico. That's exactly what I was thinking.
The crowd's trying to get into the ring.
They've got Tipton locked in the cage. His little amusement park buddies are trying to get him out. Butterfield's locking the door while Sickles is just beating on him.
The more I think about it, doesn't pro wrestling explain everything about this battle?
I think so.
I mean, whether people like it or not, it really. And also, I've often said, people are fake, pro wrestling's real. So I'll just leave it at that.
There you go.
So, but I think we look at that here's someone that how do we? Yes, is his importance to the historical record, could we dare say heroic?
Right.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, I've used Tipton photos for a lot of tours, and it's given an enlightenment of what we have. But also, we can't if you love the battlefield, if you love preservation, if this is what you espouse, well, you also have to be very willing to concede that William Tipton also didn't do some not so nice things.
So next time you look at your Tipton photography online, do not forget what this man did to destroy the battlefield. And I'm going to drop my mic.
Please don't. We have to pay for that.
I just slapped the table instead. But okay, so thanks for bringing it. I wouldn't say Tipton is a popular example of bad history because most people don't even realize it.
Yeah.
They just see these photos shared on Facebook. But that's one that rustles my jimmies a little bit. And I'm glad that we've unrustled me here today to at least cover that.
Well, happy to set you up for that right there. That's what I'm here for.
Should we let the bloodied pulp of William Tipton out of the cage right now and move on to something else?
I think they're going to have to take him out in a stretcher right now.
Exactly.
So this is now turned into a stretcher match. So I think what we see is, and obviously there's a lot with day 2. And actually a question that we really liked was posed by our friend Rick Allen.
Oh, yeah. Superfan
Rick from the greater Baltimore area.
Glen Burnie, I think. I'm not sure
somewhere around there.
Yeah.
But, and if you don't know who Rick is, he has done some magnificent work on Georgia troops that have fought in the Wheatfield. His work on Anderson's brigade is top-notch work. And if you're really looking for kind of deep dive, granular history,
regimental history,
man, that's right there. Yeah. But he poses the question, the idea of bad history, that the Wheatfield changes hands multiple different times.
6, no less.
And
6 times.
At a minimum 6.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to kind of delve into that because also we really have not talked much Wheatfield on the show.
No, we keep saying
and we kind of need to do it at some point.
We keep saying we're going to do a hard-hitting multi-parter on the Wheatfield, and we just haven't gotten there yet. But it's coming, folks. It's coming. And we will address or not address, as Superfan Rick is called out. Did the Wheatfield change hands 6 times? Discuss.
And the question is, what defines changing hands?
Yeah. See, here's the thing, right?
I mean, how do we actually... there's not a point in the battle where it's like capture the flag, where all of a sudden above the Wheatfield there's a Confederate flag, then a few moments later there's a Union flag, vice versa.
Yeah.
And I think depending on where you were in the Wheatfield, you might have a different sense that the field changes hands a number of different times than in other parts.
Well, and I've always said that on tours. I've always said, there are parts of it that change hands multiple times. I'm not even willing to put a stake in the ground on 6, even though I know a lot of people use that number. But it clearly does not change hands as a whole 6 times.
At least in the sense we think of it.
Well, I'm defining change hands as, like you said, literally one side goes in and the other goes out. To me, that's changing hands. And I'm putting a stake down that says I don't know what kind of math would get that to 6 times. I know you and I have talked in the past about looking at the Wheatfield as phases. Give credit where it's due. Jorgensen kind of did that in his Wheatfield books as well. But does it change hands 6 times? No. Do parts of it change hands 6 times? I don't know. Fighting over a stone wall and then somebody. I have a hard time even coming up with 6 on that. I did do a count. Would you like to see my count?
Yes.
Can I share it with everybody? So, and thank you again, Rick, for this compelling question. So if you break down the phases now into a definition of changing hands, right? Anderson attacks. Couple of Burling's guys retreat. Don't count that as one.
I'm not counting
because
it.
you still have de Trobriand in the Wheatfield.
Right.
Okay. Then Anderson kind of hits de Trobriand. De Trobriand starts to retreat. So you could kind of say, okay, your third corps guys are starting to pull out. Then Kershaw shows up and, with...
Well, what about Tilden and Schweitzer?
That's actually where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Kershaw shows up, and again, not heavy fighting, but he seems to force Tilton and Schweitzer
So we're
back.
still not changing hands, though.
I'm going to call that one.
You think?
I'm going to
Okay.
call that one because for the most part, even third corps guys have not gone completely out of the Wheatfield. But I'm going to say for now, I'm going to draw my line and say, look, the Confederates right now kind of have that Stony Hill, 17th Maine Stonewall. I'm going to count that as one.
And it also goes back to what do we define actually as the Wheatfield?
Stop.
Yeah.
I mean, do we look at the 22-acre physical field of wheat more or less? Or what about the woods around? I mean, where does Devil's Den formally end and the woods begin? I mean,
I would say once you come out of Rose's Woods, you're into the Wheatfield.
I think so. That also adds another little wrinkle into things.
I'm counting Stony Hill, even though wheat is not ripening on Stony Hill.
It's the
all right.
highest level of possession at that time.
So I'm gonna be generous and I'm gonna call this one. So Jody, you want to keep count? Okay. But then what happens, right? Caldwell counterattacks.
Right.
Let's say Caldwell comes out and pushes everybody out. Two, right? And then what happens, though? The Confederates counterattack, and basically Caldwell's guys are pushed out. And then again, you have the whole thing with the U.S. regulars coming in and Tilton coming back or Schweitzer's coming back. But I don't really see them coming back in and taking control of the field, right? They come in, and then they kind of get swept away. So my final count is 3.
And I think you're being very generous in what the idea of what changing hands is.
Well, yeah.
I mean, and so I think that already shows if you're going to 6, well...
We got 2.5.
Right.
And I think if you read enough about Civil War combat, it is not as cut and dry as people want it to be. Because also, at the end of the day, what you see in the Wheatfield, essentially the Union Army has one part of it. The Confederates have the other part.
So
does anybody actually hold the Wheatfield?
Well, no,
I mean,
right?
what's your definition?
Land.
I mean, so I think that's where in the Wheatfield is a prime example of it is so confusing. And I know, Jody, you were very kind enough to set up a tour a couple years ago for me in the Wheatfield. We had a large group of folks out there. And that was kind of what we got into. And I believe I actually started out my tour by saying, I don't understand the Wheatfield. And immediately everybody kind of looked at me like, what do you mean you don't understand the Wheatfield? We've hired you to do a Wheatfield tour.
I was thinking I was going to save some money.
And well, that's why I always get paid up front. But what I ended up saying is that the veterans that fought in the Wheatfield, the commanders that were in the Wheatfield, did not fully understand the Wheatfield. How could they have?
Right.
And so when you're now placing all of these accounts into place, it can be very jumbled because there is a lot of action at different times with some units coming back. I mean, my God, Anderson's guys are in the fight the whole time.
Yeah.
I mean, you have, other units that are coming back and forth. So it does not lend itself to being understood. So I think that's why I tend to view with more the kind of phase idea of it rather than, because I think that gives you a little more wiggle room.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to poor interpretation, though. People trying to interpret it to simplify it so much so that other people understand it. And they're oversimplifying it.
And we talk about the idea of accurate interpretation.
Yeah.
Well, maybe in the Wheatfield's case, the best interpretation of the Wheatfield should be to emphasize the confusion, the chaos.
Well, I think that's right.
What the Wheatfield was.
I think that's right. And I think, you look at all the back and forth of the Wheatfield, and part of the reason people get confused is because of the jumble of the different commands there. Third Corps, Second Corps, Fifth Corps, U.S. regulars, multiple brigades on the Confederate side.
Hood
which,
and
of course,
McClaw's guys in there.
Which,
but
of course,
the hot
aren't
mess
really
of
marked
day 2
at
that
all.
we love.
It is one of the reasons why we love Day 2 is a hot, just sort of rolled out of bed, hot mess kind of thing. But I think, I agree. I mean, I think it's more the chaos and the confusion. I understand why it's chaotic. You look at something like Pickett's charge. You look at some of the fighting on the first day, which is bloody, but it's not back and forth. You know, you look at Caldwell doing essentially a division-sized counterattack. You don't really have other examples of that at Gettysburg on the field at that level. So,
I mean, the closest thing might be Pender. On day one.
Well, I've been on the Union side,
Yeah,
but
Union side, certainly.
Yeah, but it's the back. It is the back and the forth. So, like I said, I can come up with a generous account and say, let's say 3.
And I think what Rick is, I think, hitting at is that how do we really know how many times this thing changed hands fully? And I mean, when does the Wheatfield fight exactly end?
I know Rick. I know Rick well, and I think Rick was getting it, wanting to tweak the nose of the establishment.
And I like that too.
Yeah.
I mean, believe me, I think, I hate to say it, at some time, some of the worst purveyors of bad history are some of the people that the public looks to be your truthful or good source of history. Now, I'm not going to name a lot of names here, but you think about it. I mean,
I've seen it on YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen it on YouTube. You've seen a lot of things that,
all kinds of things.
I have.
There's all kinds of stuff on YouTube. A lot of good classic pro wrestling, by the way.
Oh, sure. But like Dusty getting his leg broken in the cage.
That, go to YouTube and use your Google search on your YouTube to search Dusty gets his leg broken by the Four Horsemen.
And now going
not
forward.
Not the Wheatfield.
Not going forward.
Or Dusty breaks his leg in the Wheatfield.
Yeah.
How cool would that be?
I was thinking Sickles breaks Dusty's leg.
Being a historical interpreter is an art form. It's as much skill. I mean, you have to have the knowledge. You have to have the knowledge base. But what you're having to do is take very complex events, and I don't want to say simplify in the sense that but you have to make it understandable.
You got to break it down. I mean, you got to make it understandable and entertaining in a sense, and and you got to find a way to relate to the people you're talking to.
Maybe the best way to interpret it is to sort of steer into some of these unknowns more. There's a tendency for historians to always show how much we know. It's sometimes good to say what we don't know too. And in the Wheatfield, there's a lot of things we don't fully know. Well, and that's what ultimately leads to future research.
Well, what I'd like to see more of us do is I'd like to see more. And again, we talked about how I've spent really a career focusing on unpopular guys. I'd like to see more people tackling unpopular topics because, frankly, it's not all that enlightening to say Buford was great. That's not super enlightening anymore.
Do we need another Longstreet book?
Yeah, well,
really. I mean, another Longstreet was wronged. Here's why he's right.
Well,
it's already been done. It was done in the 1980s, folks.
And we've talked about now how we're kind of in the age of Meade was wronged, and we're going to see a plethora of Meade was wronged books and all that stuff. I'd like to see people tackle more unpopular stuff because, frankly, that's where you really get your new information from. The stuff that people haven't wanted to tackle because, it's Sickles, or I hate Custer, or stuff like that. That's, Custer might not be a great example there because he is a topic that a lot of people have tackled. But in general, I want to see more people out there kind of challenging the popular notions, and like I said, it's just not all that enlightening to say, okay, I like Buford and Reynolds. Well, okay, who doesn't? Sort of thing.
Henry Heath. Maybe, I don't know. Because they surprised him.
I think Heath.
That's why.
I think Heath would have shook Buford and Reynolds' hands.
He actually would have. I mean, from what you read about Heath, he was a very popular guy.
Yeah, exactly. He's gregarious.
Ambrose Burnside was his best friend. That's pretty cool.
Right. They were all in the mess together and all that stuff. They would have loved that.
But I think it is you're right. These tough topics are hard for people to sometimes grasp. Yeah. And I think tough topics, I think that's a good segue to July 3rd. July 3rd is, as it relates to what history is going to come to know as Pickett's Charge, there's not a more famous moment associated with Gettysburg than that one.
No, I think...
in terms of popular culture, literature, movies, you name it. And July 3rd itself, we were thinking to ourselves when we were putting these lists together, how much stuff is there on July 3rd alone? And we've just barely scratched the surface of July 1st and July 2nd here. So maybe should we come back for July 3rd?
I think because, not only is July 3rd Pickett's Charge, East Cavalry Field is overflowing with bad history.
Culp's Hill.
I was going to say, and yes, we know Culp's Hill fans. We didn't really touch on Culp's Hill. Somebody put Spangler's Spring on our list, which is a great one. So we come back to Culp's Hill. South Cavalry Field, all kinds of stuff going on there. What does Meade do in the aftermath? I think I think we should really leave the fans wanting more at this point, and Volume 2 of Bad History should just be July 3rd.
I think that is the proper course of action we should take here, I think.
Because, sometimes people say we go on too long. This is our chance
or we
to
goof
cut it
around
off.
too much.
Yeah, I know. Well,
we get that.
We have good history, but we need more serious history.
That's, if people don't think I do serious history, I can tell them what they can do with themselves, but that's okay.
Oh, my.
But they all have dreams.
So, different dreams?
Yes, different dreams.
Is that bad history that we didn't even talk about? The guys were like pontificating behind the lines here. Armistead crying over Hancock.
Yeah.
Different dreams.
Did that happen? Was that in the movie?
Yeah, so you haven't seen the movie in a long time. That stuff is all over the movie.
Yeah.
All over it.
And Civil War generals were known to break out in soliloquies.
Exactly.
At any time, almost Shakespearean in nature.
And cry.
And cry, yes. Yep. There's a lot of hugging and manly embraces and weeping.
I'll add Armistead Hancock to the July 3rd Bad History.
I think so. So I think
I'm actually looking forward to that. That's going to be like a great show.
What we have is there is no absence of bad history here.
Mm-hmm.
And what I hope we've shown in maybe a less serious manner, but is that don't just assume what you're hearing or what you're reading or what you hear on a tour or on a ranger program is the be-all, end-all interpretation of this.
And consider your source.
Consider your sources. And also, not to quote the internet, do your own research. Look up these sources and don't just rely on folks that are using secondary sources. And that's how, and it's okay to develop your own ideas in the battle. And even if sometimes they're wrong, it's good that you're developing ideas. Yeah, that's a good thing.
As long as they can be challenged, right? I mean, if you want to sit there and tell the guide that, yes, you metal detected at the peach orchard, and then you find out, no, I didn't do that. Although it is, we're sort of ending with messages and morals and all that stuff, I'll throw mine in here. Lighten up, folks.
Yeah.
I see people just get like really angry over some of this stuff. I get it. You love history. You love the Civil War. You love Gettysburg. It frosts your mug.
History is passionate.
It frosts. Well, it needs to be a little dispassionate, and only because it frosts.
Yes.
It frosts people's mugs when they hear a ghost story or somebody saying the wrong thing. Our job as good historians is to find the way to break through that. If you literally took everybody on a tour who knew all of this stuff, why would they come out to see us? So our job as historians is to try to do the best we can to communicate the good history. And, I don't get when, some people say to me all the time, like, oh, well, you got stupid questions. No, I mean, bad history to me is seldom. Don't get me wrong. I don't like being interrupted. Wink, wink. But the idea being that, if somebody asks a bad question, at least they're engaged enough. And it's our job to give them good history. And that's really what we should strive for here at the Battle of Gettysburg podcast and every day. And God bless America and God bless Dan Sickles.
So I think on that very emphatic statement, we will put a bow on this episode. Remind you folks, if you want to find out how you can review the show, support the show, any information where you can find us on social media and contact us, that is all in the show notes of the episode. So please check that out if you have any questions relating to that. But I think this is where we will put an end on things tonight. And I think we will be coming back with what looks to be July 3rd, Bad History at Gettysburg.
Take care, folks.
And don't forget to get all your favorite Battle of Gettysburg podcast swag at our website, thebattleofgettysburgpodcast.com.